The 72nd floor of Thornton Enterprises glowed like a beacon against the bruised New York skyline, its floor-to-ceiling windows framing a city that never slept. William Thornton sat alone in his office, the leather chair creaking faintly under his weight. At 67, he carried the look of a man who'd built an empire with his bare hands, sharp jawline softened by time, gray eyes hard as steel, and a mane of silver hair swept back with meticulous care. The desk before him, a slab of polished walnut, held a single cup of coffee, long gone cold. It was past 10, and the hum of the city below was a distant murmur, drowned by the silence of his solitude. He leaned back, fingers steepled, staring at the framed photograph on the wall, a younger Will shaking hands with the mayor, a ribbon cutting for the company's first tower. Success. Power. That's what it had all been for. Yet tonight, the weight of it felt heavier than usual, pressing against his chest like an uninvited guest. His phone buzzed, a sharp vibration cutting through the stillness, a text from his assistant. Rumors circulating. Press sniffing around about a dark secret in your past. Call me. Will's lips tightened into a thin line. The press. Vultures circling for scraps, always eager to tear down what he'd built. He dismissed the message with a flick of his thumb. Whatever it was, he'd handle it. He always did. Control was his currency. Control of markets, of men, of himself. There was no room for weakness in this world. He stood, smoothing the lapels of his tailored suit, and crossed to the window. The city sprawled beneath him, a glittering tapestry of ambition and chaos. His reflection stared back, a ghost in the glass, and for a moment, he saw something flicker in those gray eyes, something softer, something he'd buried long ago. He turned away, grabbing his coat. Fresh air might clear the unease gnawing at him. The elevator ride was a quiet descent from the heavens, the ding of each floor a countdown to reality. When the doors opened, the lobby of Thornton Enterprises greeted him with its usual opulence, marble floors, crystal chandeliers, the faint scent of polished wood. A security guard nodded as Will stepped out into the crisp March night, the wind tugging at his scarf. He decided to walk the 2 blocks to his car, a rare indulgence in a life dictated by chauffeurs and schedules. The streets were alive despite the hour, cabs honking, pedestrians weaving through the glow of neon signs. He passed a bodega, its lights flickering, and a young couple laughing over steaming cups of coffee. Their hands brushed, and Will's gaze lingered a heartbeat too long. He quickened his pace, shoving his hands deeper into his pockets. Then he saw her. She stood at the corner, hunched against the wind, a figure so ordinary she might have vanished into the crowd if not for the flowers. A small cart beside her held bundles of daisies and roses, their colors muted under the street lamp's harsh glow. Her hair, once a cascade of chestnut curls, was now gray and pinned back, her face lined with years he couldn't count. She wore a threadbare coat, too thin for the chill, and her hands trembled as she arranged the blooms. A cardboard sign read, "Flowers, $5. Will stopped, something tugging at the edges of his memory. She looked up and their eyes met, hers a faded hazel, his cold and searching. Recognition didn't come, not fully, but her voice did. "Buy a flower, sir?" she asked, soft but steady, the kind of voice that had weathered storms. He reached for his wallet, a reflex. "How much for the lot?" His tone was clipped, businesslike, the way he spoke to subordinates. She blinked, surprised. "200, I suppose, but you don't have to. I'll take them." He pulled out the bills, crisp and new, and pressed them into her hand. Her fingers brushed his, rough and cold, and he pulled back as if stung. "Keep them moving, I don't need the clutter." She hesitated, clutching the money. "Thank you, sir. It's for him, you know. Him." The word hung there, vague and heavy, like a stone dropped into still water. Will frowned, irritation, prickling. "I don't need your thanks, just move along." She nodded, tucking the cash into her coat, and turned back to her cart. He walked away, the encounter already fading into the rhythm of the night. But her voice followed him, a whisper on the wind. For him. Back in his car, a sleek black Bentley parked under the watchful eye of a valet. Will sank into the leather seat, the engine purring to life. The city blurred past as he drove toward his Long Island estate, but his mind stayed on that corner. Who was she? A beggar, a hustler, a ghost from a life he'd left behind. He shook his head, jaw tightening. It didn't matter. He'd given her the money to end the moment, not to start a mystery. Yet as he passed the neon glow of Times Square, a memory flickered. A girl with chestnut curls laughing under a rain-soaked awning, her hand warm in his. Margaret. Maggie. The name surfaced like a splinter under skin, sharp and unwelcome. 40 years ago he'd walked away from her. From love. From everything soft and fragile, because his father had called it weakness. A Thornton doesn't bend, William, the old man had said, voice like gravel. You want this empire, you choose it over her. And he had. He'd chosen power over promises, steel over heart. Maggie had begged him to stay, tears streaking her face, but he'd turned his back, convinced honor lay in ambition, not attachment. The last he'd heard, she'd vanished from his world, swallowed by the city he now ruled. The estate loomed. Ahead, a white fortress against the dark, its gates swinging open at his approach. He parked, the silence of the mansion enveloping him as he stepped inside. The grand foyer echoed with his footsteps, portraits of ancestors staring down in mute judgment. He poured a scotch, the amber liquid catching the light, and stood by the fireplace. The warmth did little to thaw the chill in his bones. That woman, her voice, for him. Who was him? A son? A brother? A stranger? Will sipped the drink, the burn steadying him. It was nothing, a coincidence. He'd built his life on discipline, on burying the past. Whatever the press dug up, whatever that flower seller meant, he'd face it with the same unflinching resolve. That had carried him this far. But as he set the glass down, the flicker in his reflection caught his eye again. Something softer. Something lost. For the first time in decades, William Thornton wondered if control was all he had left. The next evening, the city wore a different skin. A light drizzle streaked the air, turning the streets into a mirror of blurred lights and restless shadows. William Thornton drove his Bentley through the familiar grid of Manhattan, the wipers slicing rhythmically across the windshield. He hadn't planned to leave the office early. There were reports to review, calls to make, but the unease from last night clung to him like damp wool. That woman, her voice, the flowers. It was nothing, he'd told himself all day. Yet, here he was, steering toward the corner where he'd seen her, as if drawn by some invisible thread. He parked a block away, the engine's hum fading into the patter of rain. The street lamp cast a pale glow over the spot, and there she was, again, Margaret, though he wouldn't let himself name her yet. She stood beside her cart, a battered umbrella shielding her from the drizzle. The flowers looked sadder tonight, their petals drooping under the weight of the wet, but she tended them with a quiet care, her fingers brushing each stem as if they were fragile treasures. Will watched from the car, the heater's warmth fogging, the edges of the windows. He should drive on. This was a distraction, a lapse in discipline, but his hand lingered on the key, and he stayed. She didn't see him at first. She was humming, a faint lilting tune that pierced the rain's soft drone. It tugged at him, a melody he couldn't place but felt in his bones. He stepped out, the cold biting through his overcoat, and approached with measured steps. The umbrella hit her face until he was close enough to smell the damp earth of the flowers. Evening, he said, voice low and even, the way he opened boardroom negotiations. She looked up, hazel eyes catching the light. Recognition flickered there, brief as a candle flame, but she masked it quickly. Back for more flowers, sir? Her tone was steady, tinged with a warmth he didn't deserve. He shook his head, rain beating on his silver hair. Just passing by. You're out late. It's when people need flowers most, she replied, adjusting a rose. After work, after fights, after regrets. She paused, then added softly, or before they forget. The words landed like a pebble in still water, rippling through him. He studied her, the lines etched around her mouth, the way her shoulders, hunched against more than just the cold. She was Maggie, no doubt now. The girl who'd once danced with him in a cramped apartment, barefoot and laughing, her curls bouncing with every step. He'd loved her then, fiercely, until his father's voice had drowned it out. She'll drag you down, William. A Thornton rises alone. You remind me of someone, he said, testing the waters, keeping his expression neutral. She smiled faintly, a curve of resilience rather than joy. I get that a lot. Faces blur after a while, don't they? Not always. He glanced. At the cart, then back at her. You said something last night. For him. Who's him? Her hands stilled, the rose trembling between her fingers. For a moment she seemed to weigh her answer, her gaze drifting to the shadows beyond, the lamp. Someone who mattered, she said at last. Someone who waited for promises that never came. The air thickened between them, heavy with unspoken history. Will's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice steady. Promises are for fools who think words change anything. Results matter. She looked at him then, really looked, and the weight of her stare pinned him in place. Maybe. But some promises leave scars when they break. You ever feel that, sir? He didn't answer. He couldn't. Instead, he turned his eyes to the bench across the street. A weathered slab of wood under a sagging awning. 40 years ago, they'd sat there, sharing a cigarette and dreaming of a life that didn't bend to his father's rules. She'd worn his jacket, too big for her small frame, and pressed her cheek against his shoulder. We'll make it, Will, she'd said, together. He'd promised her then, a reckless vow sealed with a kiss. 2 weeks later, he'd walked away. Maggie followed his gaze, and her breath caught. She stepped to the bench, pulling a single daisy from her cart, and placed it on the seat. The gesture was small, deliberate, a quiet ritual that spoke louder than words. Will's chest tightened, a pang he couldn't name. Why do that? He asked, sharper than he intended. For memory, she said simply, turning back to him. Some things deserve to be remembered, even if they're gone. He wanted to argue, to say memory was a luxury he'd traded for power, but the word stuck. Instead, he pulled out his wallet again, fishing for another bill. Take this. Get out of the rain. She shook her head, pushing his hand back gently. I don't need pity. I've made my peace with the wet and the cold. It's not pity, he snapped, then softened his tone. It's practical. You'll catch your death out here. She smiled again, sadder this time. Death's been chasing me a long time. I'm still standing. He pocketed the money, feeling oddly rebuked. The rain picked up, drumming against the umbrella, and he stepped back. Suit yourself. Good night. Good night, sir, she called as he turned away. And be careful what you dig for. Some secrets don't like the light. He froze, mid-step, her warning slicing through the haze of memory. Did she know about the press? About him? He glanced back, but she'd returned to her flowers, humming that tune again. The sound followed him to the car, a ghost he couldn't shake. Inside, the heater blasted, but the chill stayed with him. He gripped the steering wheel, staring at the daisy on the bench through the rain-streaked glass. Maggie, the girl he'd loved and left, the woman who'd stood there tonight, weathered but unbroken, hinting at a hymn he couldn't place. A son? A brother? A shadow from their past? Will drove off, the city blurring into streaks of light. He told himself it was coincidence, that she was just a relic of a life he'd outgrown. But her words, some secrets don't like the light, echoed in his skull, louder than the rain. For the first time in decades, William Thornton felt the edges of his control fraying, and he didn't know why. The Long Island estate stood like a silent sentinel against the night, its white walls gleaming under the moon's pale glow. William Thornton paced the grand foyer, his footsteps muffled by the Persian rug beneath his polished shoes. The air smelled of old wood and wax, a scent that usually steadied him, but tonight it felt stifling. He'd slept poorly. Maggie's words, "Some secrets don't like the light," looping through his mind like a scratched record. Now, as dawn crept over the horizon, he stood by the fireplace, its embers long dead, clutching a tablet that buzzed with the morning's headlines. The screen glowed with Nathan Evans' latest piece. Thornton Enterprises, a legacy built on sand. The words cut deeper than Will expected, each sentence a calculated jab at his empire. Sources suggest William Thornton's rise was paved with ethical shortcuts, whispers of a past he's buried under wealth. It wasn't the accusations that stung. Those were vague, unsubstantiated. But the name, Nathan Evans, something about it gnawed at him, a splinter he couldn't pull free. He tossed the tablet onto the leather sofa and poured a scotch, though the clock read barely 6. The amber liquid trembled in the glass, catching the first rays of light through the tall windows. He didn't drink. Not yet. It was a ritual, a test of restraint. Control was his shield, and he wouldn't let a faceless reporter strip it away. But the press wasn't the only shadow lurking today. Tonight was the annual Thornton Gala, a glittering affair where Wall Street's elite would sip champagne and size him up. If this story gained traction, they'd smell blood. The drive back to Manhattan was a blur, the Bentley's engine a low growl beneath his thoughts. He arrived at Thornton Enterprises just as the city woke, its glass tower piercing the sky like a blade. His assistant, Clara, met him at the elevator, her tablet in hand and her voice clipped. "The board's antsy, sir. Langley's been calling. Says he wants a meeting before the gala." "Edward Langley?" Will's tone was ice. "Let him stew. I'll see him tonight." Clara nodded, but her eyes betrayed worry. "The article's spreading. Twitter's lighting up. They're calling it Thornton's Reckoning." "Let them talk," he said, stepping into his office. "Noise doesn't topple towers." The day passed in a haze of calls and damage control, but Will's mind kept drifting, to Maggie, to that daisy on the bench, to the him she'd mentioned. By evening he stood in his penthouse suite, adjusting his black tie in a mirror framed with gold. The man staring back was a fortress, stern, unyielding, every line on his face a testament to battles won. But tonight, he felt the cracks. The Thornton Gala unfolded at the Waldorf Astoria, a sea of crystal chandeliers and silk gowns. The ballroom buzzed with the elite, bankers, CEOs, politicians, all swirling around Will like moths to a flame. He moved through them with practiced ease, a nod here, a handshake there, his smile a mask of steel. The scotch in his hand was, untouched, a prop to steady his grip. Then, Edward Langley appeared, cutting through the crowd like a shark through water. At 70, he was a relic of old money, white hair slicked back, eyes glinting with malice. 30 years ago, Will had outmaneuvered him in a hostile takeover, a victory that had cemented Thornton Enterprises' dominance. Edward had never forgiven him. "William," Edward drawled, his voice dripping with mock warmth. "Quite the spotlight you're under tonight." Will met his gaze, unflinching. "Spotlights don't scare me, Edward. They just show what's already there." Edward smirked, swirling his champagne. "Oh, they're showing plenty. That boy, Evans, has a nose for dirt. Wonder what he'll dig up next." He leaned closer, voice dropping. "Your Honor's a hollow shell, Will. Always has been." The words hit like a fist, but Will's face remained a wall. He could feel the eyes of the room shifting toward them, the whispers rising like steam. "I don't fear words," he said, low and steady. "Only what I can't control." Edward chuckled, stepping back. "We'll see. Enjoy the party, old friend. It might be your last." Will watched him melt into the crowd, the scotch glass cold against his palm. He wanted to crush it, to let the shards bite into his skin, but he didn't. Control. That was his strength, his dignity. He set the glass down untouched and turned to the balcony, needing air. The night was sharp, the city sprawling below in a web of lights. He leaned against the railing, the wind tugging at his tie, and let his mind drift. Edward's taunt wasn't new. Rivals had slung mud before, but this felt different. Personal. Nathan Evans. The name echoed again, tugging at something buried deep. Maggie's face flashed in his mind. Those hazel eyes, that quiet resilience. Could she be tied to this? Was him the key? A waiter interrupted, offering a tray of canapes. Will waved him off, then paused. You see a flower seller out there tonight? Older woman, gray hair. The waiter nodded. Yeah, she's usually by the corner. Sells daisies, roses. Tough old bird. Out in all weather. Will's throat tightened. She say anything to you? Just thanks me when I buy a flower for my girl. Said once it's for her son, keeps her going. Her son. The words sank into him, heavy and cold. He thanked the waiter, his mind racing. Maggie had a son, a boy who'd grown up without a father, a boy who might hate the man who'd left her behind. Nathan Evans. The pieces hovered, not quite, connecting but close enough to unsettle him. Back inside, the gala's noise washed over him. Laughter, clinking glasses, the hum of power. He spotted Edward across the room, smirking with a cluster of investors. The article, the taunts, the whispers, they were a storm, gathering strength. Will straightened his spine, smoothing his jacket. Let it come. He'd built this life on discipline, on burying weakness. Whatever Nathan Evans, or Maggie, had in store, he'd face it standing tall. But as he rejoined the crowd, a memory surfaced unbidden. Maggie's hand in his, warm and trusting, under that rain-soaked awning. We'll make it, Will. He'd promised her then, and broken it. Now, 40 years later, the past was clawing its way back, and for the first time, William Thornton wondered if control alone could hold it at bay. The morning after the gala, New York woke to a gray drizzle, the kind that seeped into bones and blurred edges. William Thornton sat in his office, the 72nd floor a fortress of glass and steel, but today it felt more like a cage. The headlines had multiplied overnight. Nathan Evans' article now splashed across every financial blog, each word a chisel chipping at the foundation of Thornton Enterprises. A titan with feet of clay, one called him. Will's jaw tightened as he scrolled, but his hand stayed steady. He'd weathered storms before. This was just louder thunder. Clara buzzed through the intercom, her voice clipped. Sir, the board's requesting an emergency meeting. Langley's pushing hard. Says your silence is tanking stock. Tell them I'll address it tomorrow, Will replied, his tone flat. I've got something to handle first. He didn't explain. Clara didn't ask. She knew better after 20 years. Will grabbed his coat, the wool heavy against his shoulders, and headed out. The press could wait. Edward could wait. There was a name he needed to face, Nathan Evans, and a hunch he couldn't shake. The address wasn't hard to find. A quick call to a private investigator he kept on retainer pulled up the basics. Nathan Evans, 38, investigative journalist, offices at the Ledger, a scrappy paper in Midtown. Will drove himself, the Bentley cutting through traffic with a quiet menace. He parked a block away, the rain tapping a steady rhythm on the roof, and watched the building, a squat brick relic dwarfed by gleaming towers. It suited the man, he thought, persistent, unpolished, dangerous. Inside, the newsroom hummed with chaos, phones ringing, keyboards clacking, voices overlapping in a din of urgency. Will navigated it with the ease of a man used to commanding rooms, his presence parting the crowd like a blade. A receptionist barely out of college blinked up at him. Can I help you? Nathan Evans, Will said, voice low but firm. Tell him William Thornton's here. Her eyes widened, but she nodded, scurrying off. Moments later, Nathan emerged from a glass-walled office, his frame lean and wiry, dark hair tousled as if he'd run his hands through it too many times. He wore a wrinkled button-down, sleeves rolled to the elbows, and his hazel eyes, Maggie's eyes, locked onto Will with a mix of curiosity and steel. Mr. Thornton, Nathan said, crossing his arms. Didn't expect the king to visit the peasant's lair. Will didn't flinch. I don't play games, Evans. You've got my attention. Let's talk. Nathan gestured to his office, a cramped space littered with papers, coffee cups, and a single lamp casting a harsh glow. Will sat, the chair creaking under him, while Nathan leaned against the desk, arms still crossed. The air crackled with unspoken stakes. You're bold, Will began, his tone even. Digging into my past, what's your angle? Nathan smirked, but it didn't reach his eyes. Truth. You've built an empire, sure, but empires fall when the cracks show. I'm just shining a light. Truth's a slippery thing, Will countered. You've got rumors, not facts. Why me? Nathan's gaze hardened. Because men like you think money buries everything. People, promises, messes. My mother taught me different. Will's pulse quickened, but his face remained stone. Your mother? Yeah. Nathan's voice softened, just for a beat. Single mom, worked herself to the bone so I could eat, sleep, breathe. Told me stories about a man who chose cash over her, over us. Said he was big, untouchable. Sound familiar? The words landed like a quiet blow, and Will felt the past rush in. Maggie's tear-streaked face under that awning, her voice breaking as she begged him to stay. I'm pregnant, Will. We can figure it out. He'd turned away. Told her it was impossible that his father would disown him, that love couldn't survive on nothing. He'd assumed she'd lost the child, moved on. But here was Nathan, living proof of a choice he'd buried. He kept his voice steady, a lifetime of control holding him together. Sounds like a lot of men. Why pin it on me? Nathan leaned forward, eyes narrowing. Because I've traced your steps, Thornton. Every deal, every climb. There's a gap. 40 years back, you went from nobody to kingpin overnight. People don't vanish from your life without reason. Will met his stare, unflinching. People vanish when they're not part of the plan. That's how you build something lasting. Lasting? Nathan scoffed. My mother lasted. Through poverty. Through nights with no heat. Through raising me alone. You just stacked coins on her grave. The room shrank, the air thick with accusation. Will's chest tightened, but he didn't rise to the bait. He could see Maggie and Nathan, the same quiet fire, the same refusal to bend. You don't know me, he said, low and deliberate. You've got a story. I've got a life. Neither changes the other. Nathan straightened, grabbing a file from the desk. We'll see. I've got more coming. Sources, dates. You can't outrun it. Will stood, smoothing his coat. I don't run. I face what's mine. Write what you want, Evans. Just be. Sure, it's true. He turned to leave, but Nathan's voice stopped him at the door. One last thing. She never hated you, you know. Said you were scared. Not cruel. Funny how she saw good where I see garbage. Will paused, hand on the knob, the weight of those words sinking deep. He didn't turn back. She's a better person than most, he said, then stepped out. The rain had stopped when he reached the car, but the damp clung to him, mirroring the chill in his veins. Nathan's face, those eyes, that anger, burned in his mind. Maggie's son, his son. The truth hovered sharp and undeniable, yet he couldn't grasp it fully. Not yet. He drove back to the tower, the city a blur of steel and light. Nathan's words echoed. She never hated you. And for the first time in decades, Will felt the armor of his control crack. He'd left Maggie to protect his honor, his name. Now, facing her son, he wondered if he'd lost both long ago. The gala, Edward, the press, they were noise. This was the storm he hadn't seen coming, and it was only beginning. The Hudson River shimmered under a crescent moon, its surface a fractured mirror of the city's lights. William Thornton stood on the bank, hands buried in the pockets of his overcoat, the wind tugging at his silver hair. He'd driven here after leaving Nathan's office, drawn by a pull he couldn't name, a need to breathe, to think, to escape the suffocating weight of the day. The air smelled of wet earth and diesel, a rawness that cut through the polished veneer of his life. He hadn't planned to meet her here, but when his phone buzzed with an unknown number and a simple text, "Riverside Park, 9 p.m., please," he knew it was Maggie. She emerged from the shadows, a silhouette against the water, her gray hair catching the moonlight. She wore that same threadbare coat, a scarf knotted loosely at her neck, and carried a small paper bag. Flowers, he guessed, though they were hidden now. Her steps were slow, deliberate, as if each one cost her something. Will watched her approach, his pulse steady but loud in his ears. He'd faced down boardrooms and billionaires, yet this woman, small, unassuming, unraveled him in ways he couldn't control. "William," she said, her voice soft but clear, cutting through the river's hum. No sir this time. She knew him, and the pretense was gone. "Maggie," he replied, the name slipping out like a confession. He hadn't said it aloud in 40 years, and it tasted bitter, heavy with dust. She stopped a few feet away, her hazel eyes searching. His face. Up close, the lines of her life were stark, creases of laughter and pain etched by years he hadn't witnessed. "I didn't think you'd come." "I almost didn't." He kept his tone even, his hands still in his pockets. "But you've got my attention. Say what you need to." She nodded, clutching the bag tighter. "I saw the papers, Nathan's article. I didn't want this, him coming after you. But he's stubborn, like his father." The word landed like a stone in his gut. Father. Will's breath caught, but he held his ground, face a mask of calm. His father? Maggie's lips pressed into a thin line, and she looked out at the river, the water rippling with secrets of its own. "You, Will. Nathan's your son." The world tilted, just for a moment, and Will felt the ground shift beneath his polished shoes. He'd suspected, Nathan's eyes, Maggie's hints, but hearing it, raw and unfiltered, was a blade to the chest. His mind raced back to that night under the awning, her voice trembling. "I'm pregnant, Will." He'd dismissed it, convinced himself she'd lost the child, or lied to keep him. He'd walked away, choosing his father's empire, over her tears. Now the truth stood before him, fragile and fierce. "Why didn't you tell me?" His voice stayed low, controlled, but a crack ran through it. Anger, regret, something he couldn't name. "I did," she said, turning back to him, eyes blazing with quiet fire. "That night, I begged you to stay. You said it was impossible, that your family wouldn't allow it. I wrote you after, letters, calls. You never answered. I stopped trying when Nathan was born." Will's throat tightened, memories flickering, unopened envelopes in his dorm, calls he'd let ring out. He'd been 27, ambitious, terrified of failing his father's legacy. "I thought you'd moved on," he said, the excuse, hollow even to him. "I had to," she replied, her voice steady but laced with pain. "I worked 2 jobs, waitressing, sewing, while he slept in a drawer because I couldn't afford a crib. You built towers. I built a life." He flinched, but didn't look away. "And now? Why tell me now?" "Because Nathan's digging, and he'll find out. He's angry at a father he never knew, at a world that let you climb while we scraped by. I don't want him hurt, Will, or you." The weight of her words settled over him, heavy as the river's current. Nathan, his son, was out there, tearing at Will's life not out of greed, but justice. And Maggie, who'd borne the cost of his choice, stood here not to accuse but to protect. Will's hands clenched in his pockets, nails digging into his palms. He wanted to shout, to demand why she'd kept this silent so long, but he didn't. Control was his anchor even now. "I didn't know," he said finally, each word measured. "If I had, you'd have stayed?" She cut in, sharp but not bitter. "Don't lie to me, Will. You chose your path. I'm not here to drag you back. I just want you to see him, really see him, before it's too late." She reached into the bag, pulling out a single daisy, its petals damp and curling. "This is for you," she said, holding it out. "From him, through me. He doesn't know it yet, but it's yours." Will stared at the flower, small and fragile in her trembling hand. He didn't take it, not yet. "What do you want from me, Maggie?" "Nothing," she said, her voice softening. "I've never wanted anything but for him to be safe." "You decide what that means now." She set the daisy on the bench beside them, a quiet offering, and stepped back. The wind carried her scent, earth and faded roses, and Will felt 40 years collapse into this moment. He'd built an empire on discipline, on burying weakness, but here was his weakness, alive and breathing in a son he'd never claimed. "I need time," he said, the admission costing him more than he'd expected. "You've had 40 years, she replied, not unkindly. "Don't take 40 more." She turned then, walking back toward the shadows, leaving the daisy behind. Will stood alone, the river's murmur filling the silence. He looked at the flower, its white petals stark against the weathered wood. His son, Nathan. The boy who'd grown up in the margins of his life, fueled by a mother's resilience and a father's absence. He didn't pick it up. Not yet. But as he walked back to the Bentley, the rain starting again, Will felt the armor of his dignity crack wider. He'd faced Maggie with control intact, but inside the storm raged. Regret, shame, a flicker of something like pride. Nathan was his, and that truth would demand more than silence. For the first time, William Thornton wondered if honor wasn't in the empire he'd built, but in the family he'd left behind. The Waldorf Astoria's grand ballroom shimmered under, a constellation of chandeliers, their light fracturing across crystal flutes and polished silver. William Thornton stood at the edge of the annual financial summit, a sea of tuxedos and gowns swirling around him. It was 2 nights after Maggie's, revelation by the river, and the weight of it still pressed against his ribs. Nathan, his son, a truth he couldn't unsee. Tonight, though, the stakes were higher. The press had caught wind of something bigger, and Edward Langley's smirk across the room told Will this wasn't just noise anymore. It was war. He held a glass of scotch, the amber liquid untouched, a prop to steady his hand. The crowd buzzed with anticipation. Bankers, investors, journalists, all here for the keynote address he was set to deliver. His phone had vibrated all day with alerts. Thornton scandal brewing. Ethics pro-blooms. Nathan's latest article hadn't dropped yet, but the rumors were a wildfire, fueled by Edward's whispers. Will's jaw tightened, but his face remained a fortress. Calm, unyielding, the mask of a man who'd faced worse. Edward approached, cutting through the throng with the grace of a predator. His white hair gleamed under the lights, his smile a blade thinly veiled. "William," he said, voice smooth as venom. "You're the talk of the town tonight. Quite the spotlight for a man who loves his shadows." Will met his gaze, steady as steel. "Spotlights don't scare me, Edward. They just show what I've built." "Oh, they'll show more than that," Edward replied, sipping his champagne. "Your boy Evans has a bombshell coming. I made sure of it. Fed him just enough to light the fuse." Will's pulse spiked, but he didn't flinch. "You're playing with fire you can't control." Edward leaned closer, his breath sour with triumph. "I don't need to control it. I just need to watch it burn you down. Your honor's a sham, Will, a hollow shell I've waited 30 years to crack." The words stung, sharp and personal. But Will's grip on the glass stayed firm. He could feel the room tilting toward them, eyes darting, whispers rising like smoke. Control. That was his strength, his dignity. He wouldn't give Edward the satisfaction of a crack. "I don't fear you," he said, voice low and deliberate, "or your games." Edward chuckled, stepping back. "We'll see. Enjoy the stage, old friend. It's your last bow." The lights dimmed, a signal for the keynote. Will set the scotch down, still untouched, and moved to the podium, the crowd parting like a tide. Flashbulbs popped, a staccato assault, and he felt the heat of every lens. Nathan was here, somewhere in the throng. Will had spotted him earlier, notebook in hand, hazel eyes burning with purpose. His son. The thought steadied him as he adjusted. The microphone, the room falling silent. "Good evening," he began, voice resonant, carrying the weight of decades. "Tonight we celebrate finance, its power, its promise. But power's nothing without principle. I've built Thornton Enterprises on that truth. A murmur rippled through the audience, skepticism threading the air. Will paused, letting it settle. He could see Edward near the back, arms crossed, and Nathan closer to the front, pen poised. The moment hung, fragile and electric. "I've heard the rumors," he continued, his tone unwavering. "Questions about my past, my choices. I won't dodge them. 40 years ago, I walked away from someone I loved, someone who deserved better. I chose ambition over her, over a life we might have had. I thought it was strength. I was wrong." The room stilled, breaths held. Will's hands rested on the podium, steady as stone. "That choice cost me more than I knew. A son I never raised, a family I never claimed. I've lived with that regret, but I won't hide from it. Not tonight." Gasps punctured the silence, cameras flashing like gunfire. Nathan's pen froze, his face a mask of shock. Edward's smirk faltered, replaced by a scowl. Will pressed, on, voice rising with quiet force. "You can judge me, my company, my name. But know this. I've built something lasting, not perfect. If it falls, it won't be because I ran from the truth." He stepped back, the applause tentative at first, then swelling. Will didn't bask in it. He walked off the stage, the crowd, parting, and headed for the balcony. The air outside was sharp, the city a sprawl of light below. He leaned against the railing, the river glinting in the distance, a echo of Maggie's stand 2 nights ago. Footsteps sounded behind him. "Nathan." Will turned, meeting those hazel eyes, his eyes, Maggie's eyes, now blazing with something between fury and awe. "You think that fixes it?" Nathan's voice was rough, raw. "A speech? You don't get to play hero after 40 years. I'm not fixing anything," Will said, calm but firm. "I'm owning it. You deserve that much." Nathan stepped closer, fists clenched. "I deserved a father. She deserved a life. You don't get to wipe that clean with words." Will didn't retreat. "I can't, but I can face it. What you do next, that's yours." Nathan's breath hitched, his anger warring with something softer. "She never told me. Not until last night. Said you'd come around someday. I didn't believe her." "She's smarter than both of us," Will replied, a faint crack in his voice. "Always was." Nathan stared, then turned away, shoulders tight. "This isn't over. That article's still coming." "I know," Will said. "Write it. I'll stand by what I said." Nathan hesitated, then walked off, disappearing into the ballroom's glow. Will stayed, the wind biting his face. He'd faced Edward's taunts, the press's glare, Nathan's rage, all without breaking. But inside the storm churned, pride in a son he didn't know, shame for a life he'd left behind. Edward emerged next, his face a thundercloud. "You think that saves you? I've got documents, proof you paid her off, buried her. It's over, Will." Will met his eyes, unflinching. "Show them. I've got nothing left to hide." Edward faltered, then stormed off, his threat hollowed by Will's calm. Alone again, Will looked out at the city, his city built on choices he couldn't undo. He'd stood tall tonight, not for applause, but for Nathan, for Maggie, for the honor he'd lost and found again. The media's glare burned, but under it, he felt something new. Not victory, but dignity reclaimed. The office on the 72nd floor of Thornton Enterprises was a tomb of shadows, the city's lights bleeding, through the glass walls like distant stars. William Thornton sat at his desk, the walnut surface bare save for a single lamp, its glow pooling over a stack of papers and a pen. It was past midnight, the financial summit's echoes still ringing in his ears. Nathan's fury, Edward's threats, the crowd's stunned applause. He'd stood under the media's glare and owned his past, but the weight of it hadn't lifted. It had settled deeper, a quiet call to act. He leaned back, the leather chair creaking under him, and stared at the ceiling. Nathan's face, those hazel eyes blazing with hurt, haunted him. Maggie's voice by the river echoed too. "I just want him to be safe." Will had built an empire on control, on burying weakness. But tonight, he saw the cracks. Honor wasn't in the towers or the headlines. It was in the son he'd never known, the woman he'd left behind. He couldn't undo 40 years, but he could do this. The papers before him were a draft, his resignation as chairman of Thornton Enterprises, a transfer of assets to a trust. He'd spent hours with his lawyer earlier, crafting it in secret. The bulk of his wealth, billions in stocks, properties, cash, would fund a foundation for underprivileged youth, with a focus on education and journalism. Nathan's passions, though Will wouldn't name him as the reason. The board would howl, Edward would gloat, but Will didn't care. This wasn't for them. He picked up the pen, its weight familiar, and signed the documents with a steady hand. Each stroke was deliberate, a quiet severing of the life he'd built. He set the pen down, the finality sinking in. No press conference, no grand gesture, just a letter to Clara with instructions to file it at dawn. He'd walk away, not for redemption, but for Nathan's future, for Maggie's peace. The phone buzzed, shattering the silence. Clara's name flashed on the screen. He answered, voice low. "It's late." "Sir, I just got a tip," she said, urgency cutting through her usual calm. "Langley's leaking something to the press. Claims you paid off a woman years ago to keep her quiet. He's got forged receipts, dates. It's hitting tomorrow." Will's jaw tightened, but his pulse stayed even. "Let it hit. I've signed the papers. It's done." A pause. "You're sure? We can fight this. Spin it. Bury it." "No," he said, firm but soft. "No more burying. Let them have their story." Clara sighed, a rare crack in her professionalism. "You're a stubborn man, Mr. Thornton." "Always have been," he replied, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Good night, Clara." He hung up, the silence returning. Edward's move was predictable, vengeance dressed as justice. The receipts were lies, but the truth beneath them was real. Will had left Maggie, pregnant, and alone. He'd face the fallout, not to clear his name, but to shield Nathan from the crossfire. If the press focused on him, they might leave his son alone. He stood, crossing to the window. The city sprawled below, a kingdom he'd ruled for decades. He'd miss it, the power, the pulse, but not the weight. The Scotch decanter sat on a side table, amber glinting in the lamplight. He poured a glass, held it, then set it down untouched. Control, still his anchor. The next morning, he drove to Maggie's corner. The rain had cleared, leaving the air crisp and clean. She was there, arranging daisies under the street lamp, her hand steady despite the years. Will parked, stepping out with a small envelope in hand. No flowers, no theatrics, just him. She looked up as he approached, surprise flickering in her hazel eyes. "William," she said, softer than by the river. "Twice in a week. What's this?" He stopped a few feet away, the envelope heavy in his pocket. "I saw Nathan last night. At the summit. I told them. About you. About him." Her breath caught, hands stilling on the flowers. "You didn't have to." "I did," he said, voice low but firm. "Not for me. For him. He's yours, Maggie. Yours and mine. I've got no right to claim him, but I've got a duty to face it." She studied him, the lines of her face softening. "He's angry, you know. Always has been. But he's good. Better than us." "I see that," Will replied, a crack of pride in his tone. "I'm sorry, Maggie, for leaving, for not knowing." She shook her head, a faint smile breaking through. "I stopped needing apologies years ago. I just needed him to live. He has." Will nodded, the words sinking deep. He pulled the envelope out, details of the foundation, a note about the trust, but didn't hand it over. "I'm stepping down," he said instead. "Giving it up. The company, most of the money. It's going to kids like him, for schools, for writing. He won't know it's me." Her eyes widened, but she didn't speak. He pressed on. "Edward's coming with lies, says I paid you off. It's not true, but it'll stick. I'll take the hit. Keeps Nathan out of it." Maggie's gaze softened, a flicker of something like gratitude. "You don't have to do this, Will." "I do." he said, echoing her earlier words. It's not pity. It's what's right. She stepped closer, placing a daisy in his hand, small, damp, alive. Then take this. For you. From him. Through me. Like I said, he took it this time, the petals cool against his palm. Thank you, he said, the words rough with meaning. She smiled, full and warm, the first he'd seen in 40 years. He'd be proud, you know, if he knew. Will's throat tightened, but he nodded. Maybe someday. He turned back to the car, the daisy in his hand, leaving the envelope on her cart. She didn't call after him, and he didn't look back. The drive home was quiet, the city waking. Around him, he'd sacrificed the empire, not for applause, not for forgiveness, but for a son he'd never hold, a woman he'd never deserve. It wasn't redemption, it was responsibility. Back in the estate, he placed the daisy on the mantel, its white petals stark against the dark wood. Edward's lies would break tomorrow, but Will felt no fear. He'd stood tall, not for the world, but for them. For the first time in decades, William Thornton slept without the weight of control, just the faint, fragile hope of honor reclaimed. The December chill settled over New York like a soft shroud, frosting the edges of Riverside Park with a delicate shimmer. William Thornton sat on a bench by the Hudson, the same one where Maggie had left the daisy months ago. His breath puffed in small clouds, the cold biting through his wool coat, but he didn't mind. It was Christmas Eve, and the city hummed with a quiet joy. Distant carols, the glow of lights across the water. He'd come here often since that night, not to meet her, but to feel the echo of what he'd found. 9 months had passed since he'd signed away Thornton Enterprises. The headlines had roared. Thornton quits amid scandal. Billionaires fall from grace. Edward Langley's forged receipts painting Will as a man who'd silenced a past with cash. The truth didn't matter. The story stuck. Stocks had dipped, the board had raged, but Will hadn't fought it. He'd let the empire crumble, his silence a shield for Nathan and Maggie. The trust he'd created hummed along, funding schools and newsrooms, its origins buried in paperwork only Clara understood. He'd kept his promise. No fanfare, no claim. He leaned back, hands resting on the weathered wood, the daisy from Maggie long pressed in a book at home. The estate felt emptier now, its grand halls a museum of a life he'd outgrown. He'd sold most of it, art, cars, the trappings of power, living simply in a brownstone a few blocks from here. The Scotch decanter sat untouched in a cupboard. He hadn't needed its burn since that night. Control had shifted, not lost, into something quieter, truer. Footsteps crunched on the path and Will looked up. Maggie emerged from the dusk, her gray hair tucked under a knit cap, a basket of flowers in her arms. She stopped, surprise flickering in her hazel eyes, then softened into a smile. William, she said, her voice warm against the cold. Didn't expect you here tonight. Neither did I, he replied, standing with a faint creak of joints. Habit, I guess. She nodded, setting the basket down. Good habits are hard to come by. She pulled out a small daisy, twirling it between her fingers. For you, if you'll take it. He did, the petals cool and familiar in his palm. Always, he said, the word rough with gratitude. They sat together, the bench creaking under, their weight, the river a steady murmur beside them. Silence stretched, comfortable, heavy with years unspoken. Will broke it first. How's Nathan? Maggie's smile widened, pride lighting her face. Good. Better. He's writing again. Real. Stories, not just knives aimed at you. Took a job with a non-profit paper, chasing truth his way. Will's chest warmed, a flicker of pride he didn't claim. He's got your fire. And your stubbornness, she added, a teasing lilt in her voice. He knows, Will. About the trust. Figured it out last month, pieced it together from the grants hitting his beat. Will's breath caught, but he kept his face steady. I didn't want him to. I know, she said, resting a hand on his arm. That's why he respects it. Didn't come yelling, just Watched. Said it's the first time he saw you clear. He nodded, the words sinking deep. Nathan knew, his son knew, and hadn't stormed in with accusations. It was enough. More than enough. Across the park, lights flickered. A small gathering near the water. Will squinted, catching the glow of a Christmas tree, its branches strung with bulbs and tinsel. Figures moved around it, kids laughing, adults handing out cups of cocoa. Nathan's silhouette stood out, tall and wiry, passing ornaments to a cluster of children. Maggie followed his gaze, her smile softening. "He's there every year," she said. "Brings the kids from the shelter, gives them a night to feel big. Started it after his first big story, said it's what matters." Will watched, the scene etching itself into him. Nathan bent to lift a girl onto his shoulders, her laughter ringing out as she placed a star on the tree. The light caught his face, those hazel eyes, that quiet strength, and Will saw Maggie in him, saw himself too. Not the Titan, but the man beneath, the one he might have been. "He's better than me," Will said, voice low, raw. Maggie squeezed his arm, her touch light but firm. "He's ours, Will. That's enough." They sat in silence, the trees' glow painting the night. Will felt the daisy in his hand, its fragility a mirror to the moment. He'd sacrificed the empire, not for absolution, but for this. A son thriving, a woman at peace, a legacy that didn't need his name. Edward's lies had faded, the press had moved on, and Thornton Enterprises was a shadow under new hands. Will remained, not broken, but whole in a way he hadn't expected. "I'm glad you told me," he said, finally turning to her. "About him. About us." She met his eyes, steady and warm. "I'm glad you listened." He nodded, the river's murmur filling the quiet. Maggie stood, brushing off her coat. "Come see," she said, tilting her head toward the tree. "Just for a minute." Will hesitated, then followed. They stopped at the edge of the gathering, close enough to hear Nathan's voice, low, patient, guiding the kids. He didn't see them, didn't need to. Will watched, the daisy still in his hand, and felt the weight lift. Not gone, but shared. Maggie handed him the basket. "Take these home," she said. "Brighten that place up." He took it, the flower's scent rising soft and earthy. "I will." She smiled, then walked off toward the tree, joining the circle. Will stayed back, the cold wrapping around him, but inside he was warm. He turned away, heading to the brownstone, the basket a quiet companion. Inside, he placed the daisies on the mantel beside the pressed one, their white petals stark against the dark wood. He stood there, the city's hum a distant song, and thought of Nathan's tree, Maggie's strength, the life he'd missed but helped shape. He'd lost the empire but found honor, not in power but in them. The light in his chest didn't fade, and for the first time in 40 years, William Thornton felt it was enough. If this journey of honor, sacrifice, and quiet strength moved, you don't forget to hit that like button. It means the world to me. And if you want more stories that tug at the heart and lift the spirit, subscribe now. Let's keep exploring what makes us human together.